And today I've got the second of a new series covering papers of one of the most prominent anti-federalist writers, Cato. In fact, Cato published the first ever anti-federalist essay. And on this episode, I'm going to highlight his second paper, which is a little bit of a back and forth between Cato and another writer, most likely Alexander Hamilton, who used the name Caesar. If that tells you enough about Caesar's views or Hamilton's views or whoever that may have been, that should be enough in some ways. But Caesar, unsurprisingly, tells the people after Cato said in his first paper, hey, let's deliberate, let's be cautious, let's stick to principles over personalities, let's not rush into this, let's give it a good examination. Caesar, unsurprisingly, basically says, ratify it how it is, no amendments, no changes, take it or leave it, because you're either going to get it or you're going to get a military dictatorship. What a surprise. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow us. All the archives for closing in on 4 years. On individual episodes like this one today, I publish a blog post for every single episode over at our show homepage, and there you're going to find not only all the platforms we're on, both video and audio only, the live streaming ones, the archive ones, the podcast edition like at Apple and Spotify, and yes, on Spotify and Podbean. We're not jumping off anywhere. We want to be on every platform possible. And you can also find all the links and stuff that I'm talking about. I include those. I publish it about 1 to 2 hours after the live broadcast is done, and stuff that I reference, like original source documents, Caesar's letter, Cato's letter, and some other episodes and informational stuff that you want to read in context so you can learn more, because I'm just scratching the surface. And you can also find on our show homepage our membership program, where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. And I would dare say there is no organization out there that does more with less in support of the Constitution and liberty than the TAC. While we allow people another moment or so to get notifications from those mainstream platforms and Odyssey.com, where we're live streaming, to join us on the live stream, let me just say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. There's Tim Martin in Arizona, Dixie Strong in Alabama, Justin Morrison, Clay Kent, Haji in Oakland County, Michigan. Ed Henn came for the Buffalo Steaks. Dave Simmons, Murray Ray, Michigan Liberty. Leslie Ann, good to see you. Southwest Missouri. Florida 10th, always good to see you, my friend. John Hume, Alan Hughes, been a while. Good to see you as well. I mean, it's good to see everybody. Sorry if I'm singling anybody out. Sometimes a friend pops up or someone I haven't seen in a while, and I like giving a little extra hello. There's Ed Henn. Leslie Ann says, TAC is incredible at educating the masses. We're doing our best. I would like to be more incredible and reach and teach more people. And that's where that membership program comes in if I'm going to do a little spamming. Elizabeth, Will, and Liz in Indiana say hello. Appreciate you being here. Mike Takash and everyone else. I apologize if I missed anybody. I will do my best to look at a few comments a little bit later in the show. And I also read through them later in the day and the day following, etc. Cowboy Roy Rogers from the Freedom Restoration Foundation. Awesome. Thanks for being here, everyone. Let's get right to it. I want to start out, of course, in Cato number 1, as I mentioned, which I covered in an episode at the end of January 31st, 2022. The title is Urging Caution, Anti-Federalist, Cato number 1. This, from my understanding, is really the first of the anti-federalist papers that was ever published. It didn't get into the proposed Constitution any detail. He did give a hint about a problem about standing armies, which was a huge concern on the anti-federalists. It was also a big concern on the Federalist side, but they thought it was going to be okay. Instead, he urged people to, in his words, deliberate with caution and stick to principles over personality. The big concern was, well, we've got a really popular dude, George Washington. He didn't say him by name, but everybody knew who he was talking about. This came to you from a man with support, from a man who deserves our respect. But even the greatest people can err. And if you make an error based on just following what they say, then you're going to be in a lot of trouble. So he said, stick to principles over personality. I talked about the significance of the name in that episode, that first episode, which I have up on the screen here, about the name Cato. This is for Cato the Younger, the great implacable foe of Julius Caesar. But it was also based on Joseph Addison's famous play from the early 1700s called Cato, a Tragedy. It was first staged, I think, 1713. Let me pull that one up here. Cato, a Tragedy, by Her Majesty's servants, by Mr. Addison. You can see it up on the screen here. And in that play, they celebrated Cato as a martyr for liberty to the Republican cause, not the party, but the idea of a Republican self-government form of government. And that's where Cato actually starts. In this paper number 2, he actually cites that play, a little passage, and it starts out with this. To the citizens of the state of New York. Remember, a lot of these debates were either in New York or Pennsylvania or to specific states, urging them to consider pro or con in support or against the Constitution. These debates, particularly Cato, Hamilton, Caesar, the Federalists, were mostly to people in New York. To the citizens of the state of New York. Remember, O my friends, the laws, the rights, the generous plan of power delivered down by your renowned forefathers, so dearly bought, the price of so much blood. Oh, let it never perish in your hands, but piously transmit it to your children. He's urging people, using a very popular play, something that many people had read or maybe had the chance to see. It's like if we use something from pop culture today, remember the 5th of November. There's films and things like that that we're all aware of that we can use to discuss current events. And that's what he's doing here. Like, look, remember the toil, the blood that spilled from the veins. And he actually talked about that when he's talking about the revolution later in the paper. And he said, let's think about this and make sure we take what they sacrificed and we don't twist it into something bad. And here's how he starts the paper after that. He says, the object of my last address was to caution you against precipitancy in the adoption of it. Don't rush it. To recommend a correction of its errors, if it contains any, to hint to you the danger of an easy perversion of some of its powers. He did hint at standing armies. Jason Manders over at Founder of the Day said, he didn't even talk about the Constitution in the first paper other than a sarcastic comment about that type of a power. And I think there was an intention behind that because Cato wasn't on board and just wanted to set the stage for the discussion. 2, solicit, he writes, you to separate yourselves from party. Don't follow a faction. Don't support or oppose something based on who's supporting and opposing it. That's a stupid approach. You have to think independently, be strong, be a free human being who can think on their own rather than just following what the masses or the powerful or the famous tell you. And we've got a lot of that, and maybe even worse today. He says, and be independent of and influenced by any in your principles of politics. And so that's where he started at. He said he was going to continue along those lines. He was expecting to go along those lines from his first paper, but shortly after he published that first one, September 27, 1787, a few days later on October 1st, someone published a response under the name Caesar, arguing for ratification of the Constitution using the name of a dictator. That is an interesting approach. Here from Jason Manders at Founder of the Day, one of my favorite sites for history, great, easy reading. I will link to that in the show notes. It's founderoftheday.com. Here's how Jason put it. Hamilton's tone was aggressive. First of all, he says, just after Cato wrote his first paper, Alexander Hamilton published a response under the name Caesar. And I did point out in the first episode, and I'm just going to stop saying that going forward after this, we don't know for sure that it was absolutely Alexander Hamilton. Most people today, most historians today would say, well, most historians have held that this has always been Alexander Hamilton, but we can't conclusively prove it. I cited a letter from Thomas Jefferson some years after the whole ratification debates, where he was just talking about his debates with John Adams. I think it was like 1815 or something like that. And all of a sudden he starts telling this story about a dinner party at his house, and he pointed out pictures of people like Locke, for example, Newton and others. And Hamilton didn't know who they were. And he said, oh, these are the people that I think are the greatest in history. And Hamilton just paused for a moment and said, and this is according to Jefferson, oh, I think Julius Caesar was the greatest man who ever lived. And so it wouldn't be surprising if it wasn't Hamilton, maybe it was somebody else in his camp, but certainly this was a very aggressive approach. So here from Caesar number 1, I've got, I will link to it from teachingamericanhistory.org. Caesar says, I'm glad to see that he's not going to advocate for or against. He's just going to have us think about this, blah, blah, blah. And then he gets to this. I would advise him, he's responding to Cato in the press, I would advise him to give his vote to the American Fabius. I would advise him to support the Constitution. It will be more healthy for his country and this state of New York. That he should be induced to accept the presidency of the new government than that he should be solicited again to accept of the command of an army. So it's not really a veiled threat there. He's basically saying, I advise you to vote yes, or it's very possible that dude, George Washington, may roll in at the head of an army and force it on you. This is the threat to shut up and take it, shut up and do what we want, or shut up and, well, you're going to have a dictatorship. And that's how Tara Ross described it in her blog post about this as well, taraross.com. Also, lots of great history, anecdotes, and posts over there. She said, come to the correct conclusions on any given subject, or your opinion will be silenced. Sound familiar? It certainly does. And this is the way that authoritarians have always done it. So it is very apropos that it was written by someone using the pen name Caesar. Again, very likely Alexander Hamilton, and if not, a very Hamiltonian approach. Now, Cato actually responds, and here's how he put it. He says he talks of this proffered constitution as the tender mercy of a benevolent sovereign to deluded subjects, or as his tyrant namesake of his proffered grace to the virtuous Cato. So Cato says, hey, let's think about this constitution. In response, Caesar, Hamilton, we'll just go, Hamilton says, here you go, take it or leave it. You're going to get what we've offered you, or you're going to get it by military force. This is a threat. And of course, in the text here, if you're looking up on the screen here, it's in italics. He says he talks of this proffered constitution. He's emphasizing, like putting it in scare quotes, as if it's been offered to us to accept or reject. But is that really a choice? If your choice is to accept what the government people tell you or to be shut up, that really isn't much of a choice. And in fact, that goes against the principles of the revolution. And we see a lot of that today as well, don't we? And that's how Cato put it. He says he shuts the door of free deliberation and discussion and declares that you must receive this government in manner and form as it is proffered, that you cannot revise or amend it. And that was one of the big kind of discussions. There were some anti-federalists that were against the proposed constitution no matter what. They were a very, very small minority. Most of the people on the anti-federalist side, they oppose, and they use the phrase, we oppose the constitution as it now stands. And many of them actually, like John Hancock, Samuel Adams, we can't even call them anti-federalists because they ended up supporting ratification. But their opposition was, we don't have something that clearly delineates the delegated powers to the federal government and those reserved to the people in the several states. And this was the first recommended amendment, what Caesar, Hamilton, was telling us you couldn't do during the ratification process in the Massachusetts ratifying convention. And from there, basically everybody started including recommended amendments because that was the only way they could get it passed. And the supporters, the Federalists at first, they just wanted to slam it through. They wanted to rush it through before people had a chance to talk about it, to think about it, to look at the opposition. And again, this is exactly how supporters of the monster state today approve it. Now, I'm not saying that I'm on the side of the Federalists or the Anti-Federalists. It sure sounds like I'm on one or the other. I think I'm more like Thomas Jefferson, where he says, oh, I'm neither. If I could go to heaven but with a party, I wouldn't go there at all. Anyways, so he says he shuts the door of free deliberation. And lastly, to close the scene, he insinuates that it will be more healthy for you that the American Fabius should be induced to accept the presidency of this new government than that, in case you do not acquiesce, he should be solicited to command an army to impose it on you. Imagine what the people were thinking that were reading this. This probably actually generated more opposition than it would have. Like, what are these people trying to get through here? What is actually happening? We've got General Washington tell us this great thing, telling us that it's this great thing. We've got so many other revered leaders. James Wilson had just given his State House Yard speech, and many others, and there was very little opposition from some of the so-called greats of the greats until we hear things like Patrick Henry's speeches the following summer, and then all of a sudden, there's threats. Now, this wasn't widely published or widely read throughout the states. It was maybe republished in a half dozen times early on. It wasn't as widely read as many other things, like James Wilson's speech, for example. And part of that is the cancel culture that the Federalists actually use. They actually, I shouldn't get off on a rail. Anyways, back to Tara Ross. She describes it this way. Worst of all, Caesar had implied that Americans could either accept George Washington as their first president or as a military dictator. Cato is incensed. A free people, Cato notes, can and must deliberate freely. This is so pertinent, so applicable to today. If you are a free people, you can and must debate freely. Anything other than that, and you're not a free people. George Washington, some years later, he said, when only one side of the story is heard, the mind becomes impressed with it insensibly. It's just going to stick out. That's a tool of propaganda. Shutting down discussion, said in Tara Ross's post, shutting down discussion is an insult to freedom of thought and opinion. And Cato blasts this. He said, is not your indignation roused at this absolute imperious style? And Jason Mandris's post about this, his blog post, he titles it Hamilton's Arrogance. And I was going to use something along those lines because it's a really great approach, because that's how Cato saw it. Like, look at this imperious style. You should be indignant towards this approach. But it really is a threat of a total dictatorship, our way or violence. And of course, Cato goes right to the revolution, the principles of the revolution. He highlighted, of course, that passage from the great play from 1713, Cato's play. But he goes here. For what did you open the veins of your citizens and expend your treasure? Why did you fight against a tyrant abroad? Why did you fight to get out from under the yoke of the largest empire in the history of the world up until that time? I mean, we're back under it again today. For what did you throw off the yoke of Britain and call yourselves independent? Was it from a disposition fond of change, or to procure new masters? This was a common understanding. Thomas Jefferson wrote, an elective despotism is not the government we fought for. Richard Henry Lee said an elective despotism, or the notion of a strong centralized government, is not the principles of the revolution. And here's the same thing that Cato, most likely John Williams, possibly George Clinton, governor of New York, who knows? We also know that at the time, so one of the clues that maybe leads towards George Clinton, quick side note, I discussed this more in the first episode, was that Hamilton and Clinton were kind of at it in the public press before this time. And so it's possible that Hamilton used this Caesar aggressive approach because he thought it was Clinton and didn't know who was writing in response. So not really sure. Anyways, so back to Jason Mandris. He says, Cato responds to Hamilton's aggressive talk by using it as an example of the Federalist attitudes. And this is where we get into kind of this cancel culture. Take our approach, hear what we have to say, but we don't want the opposition. You're either with us or just shut up. They canceled subscriptions to newspapers that would publish Anti-Federalist papers. So doesn't that sound familiar? They did this in Philadelphia. Thomas Greenleaf, who published the New York Journal, where Cato was published, actually had a mob violence attack on his printing press the following year in early or middle of 1788. Eliezer Oswald of the Independent Gazetteer was the only one in Philadelphia to publish any of the Anti-Federalist papers, or the dissent of the minority in Pennsylvania. So there was certainly an aggressive attack to use a cancel culture type of approach to shut up the opposition. And this is what Cato is highlighting here. He just couldn't get his word out as much as people like James Wilson and Hamilton and others. He claims, and this is how Jason puts it, he claims that their desires are to, quote, let the rich and insolent alone be your rulers. Cato further points out that should the Constitution really be the best government, the Federalists should not fear a public discourse because it should stand up to criticism. Again, this is what we go through constantly today. Whether it's a healthcare issue or a foreign policy issue, if it's not the establishment line, they just don't want to hear it. And they shut out dissent as much as possible. This is not brand new. It's been happening all along. We're just really starting to notice it. I'm grateful for social media because it makes it very obvious what's been going on all along. If you think about the times when I was a kid, I grew up with three TV stations that would actually just push out the propaganda told to you by the government people. I mean, sometimes there was a little dissent, and that was considered crazy, but in essence, they were shutting up. You didn't have the opportunity to hear dissenting voices, and that is not a free society. Now, Hamilton ended up complaining in this Caesar #1, October 1st, 1787. Hey, if you had problems with this, why didn't you respond earlier? And Jason Mann, which is pretty absurd, but then again, maybe some people weren't paying close attention. And Jason puts it this way: Cato responds with the obvious. The convention in Philadelphia met in secret. They made a deal to not share what was going on. How could anyone know what to criticize? So this is the time to criticize, because now the Confederation Congress decided to send the document for ratification to the states, and there had to be a discussion of it because it was going to be up to the people of the several states. And then Cato starts actually questioning the entire Philadelphia Convention. I thought this was interesting to include because he has this long section near the end. I just want a couple of highlights here. He basically says they went beyond what they were supposed to do, so how can we trust them? Here's how he said: we're going to have this convention of delegates appointed by the different states, and it was resolved expedient to be held for the sole and express purpose of revising it, the Articles of Confederation, and reporting to Congress and the different legislatures such alterations and provisions therein as should render the federal constitution, that is the Articles of Confederation, adequate to the exigencies of the government. He wasn't opposed to changing the Articles of Confederation. In fact, there really wasn't anyone in support of the Articles of Confederation at the time. No one wanted to keep them as is. I mean, maybe someone can point out, well, there's an outlier here. And I know a lot of people who support liberty, who think that a document somehow can enforce itself. They often tell me in messages and social media posts and things like that, oh, I wish we had the Articles of Confederation, but none of them wanted it. They thought it wasn't sufficient, it was problematic, it left a lot of issues, so they wanted to revise it. That was really the deal. And so the thought was, and this is what Cato's saying, and there is dispute about this. There are scholars that can show you the back and forth between people at the time, and it wasn't just along Anti-Federalist and Federalist line, but Cato is one who specifically said, look, I thought that they were just going to have this convention. It was going to be a secret thing. They were going to have this convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. Then it turns out it's in secret, and then they come out, and it's a whole new plan of government. Whoa, hold on a second here. That's a serious issue. So he says if the convention basically didn't follow the rules, and now some people would argue that Cato was incorrect, and I think that is probably the case, but if he wasn't alone, a lot of people thought, look, they didn't follow the rules, so how can they be trusted that this is the best form of government when they didn't even do what they were supposed to do? Now, if they had a deal that was very clear that they were going to come up with a brand new form of government, a brand new constitution, rather than amendments to the current one, then that would be a different story. Anyways, he says, what have they done? Instead, have they revised the Confederation? And has Congress agreed to their report? Neither is the fact. None of this happened. They didn't revise the Articles of Confederation. Congress didn't agree to what they said. They just passed it along. He said, this convention have exceeded the authority given to them and have transmitted to Congress a new political fabric, essentially and fundamentally distinct and different from it, as a new form of government. He said, this new government, therefore, is founded upon usurpation. Actually, he said, this new government, therefore, founded in usurpation. So in an exercise of power not delegated to the convention. Usurpation is a theft of power from the sovereign people. So if the people are the fountain of all power, and he does talk about this in this, and they do stuff that the people didn't clearly authorize, or maybe there's some dispute, he's like, this is founded in usurpation. He said, it's now referred to your opinion as the origin of power not heretofore delegated. And to this end, the exercise of the prerogative of free examination is essentially necessary. Now, he wasn't calling for any kind of prosecution, like they violated the rules or anything like that, but like, okay, we had them do this. They didn't follow those rules. Now they came up with something new. And then on top of it, we're being told to rush. He wasn't saying just shut it down automatically. We have to start anew. But look, if we're going to do this, if this is what we're looking at, we should really take our time and really examine things closely. He says, and yet you are unhesitantly to acquiesce. And if you do not, again, another reminder, the American Fabius, if we may believe Caesar, is to command an army to impose it. And so he closes it up with this. My object is to take up this new form of national government, compare it with the experience and the opinions of the most sensible and approved political authors, and to show that its principles and the exercise of them will be dangerous to your liberty and your happiness. And in the next paper, he looks to Locke and Montesquieu, etc., basically follows this approach. There is one more response from Alexander Hamilton, another Caesar paper. I'll probably discuss that a little bit going forward. And then I think between those Caesar papers, the response to it was actually pretty negative. And the response to how they shut down printing presses through canceled subscriptions like we see today, shutting out the Anti-Federalists in places like Pennsylvania, a little bit in New York as well, but not nearly as much, but using mob violence, basically just telling people, you can't do this. We don't want to hear this. They actually decided to take a different approach, and I discussed that a little bit in the first episode on this series, how Hamilton then went with the approach of the Federalists, or maybe somebody else. But basically, the Federalist side went with a more thoughtful approach rather than just railing on people, issuing threats of a dictatorship, and the like. Well, anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. I'm going to look in the chat in just a moment. I hope it was educational. I hope you learned something more than anything. I hope you see how it actually ties in today. If you just continue the trajectory, we shouldn't be surprised at the approach that the supporters of the monster state use today, because they're using the approach that the supporters of larger government at the time, now that's not saying that that was good or bad, but the supporters of bigger government than under the Articles of Confederation use the same approach. This is tried and true method. This is a tried and true approach of people who don't want to have public debate and discussion. Now, Madison, I think, was kind of the middle ground, and he recognized that this approach from the Federalists was really a bad choice, a bad strategy. And there are some letters that I can discuss. If you guys are really interested in that whole thing, I was actually thinking of putting together an episode on cancel culture in the period of ratification, especially the early days of the debates, Pennsylvania here, Cato and Hamilton, going into a little bit further detail on that as well. Maybe I'll do that in the next few days or weeks. Anyways, taking a look over in the live chat. And before doing that, I have to mention again, our membership program, $2 a month is where it starts, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And nothing, absolutely nothing helps us roll up our sleeves. I don't have many on today. Helps us roll up our sleeves and do this work in support of the Constitution and liberty and how to defend both of them more than the financial faith and support of our members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And you can also help us spread the word by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Podbean or any other podcast platform, smashing the like button, leaving comments, etc. All that stuff will trigger algorithms and help us spread the word. Taking a look over in the chat, Cowboy Roy Rogers, thank you for the info, Michael. Headed to my Constitution playlist to bring attention to others. Awesome. I really appreciate that. Hopefully it's interesting to listen to as well. A lot of times I listen to like history lectures and things like that, and I'm like, oh man, this is boring. So hopefully at least this is not too long and it's somewhat entertaining as well. Alan Mosley, thank you for posting a link to the membership program on the Facebook chat. Pound those likes and shares, says Alan. Leslie Ann, wonderfully educational as always. Thanks, Bolden. I appreciate that, Leslie. Devin Fuller, it amazes me they blaze over this in school and give it little to no thought. Yeah, I never, ever heard any of this stuff in school. I mean, I knew there were Anti-Federalists. I knew there were Federalists, but I didn't know anything about this Caesar paper. None of this kind of really important part of the debate. You are told, look at the Federalists. We're, of course, told the Federalists is the only way to understand the Constitution or the Philadelphia Convention. And I think the reason behind that is manipulative. They want us to see the views of Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, although Madison wasn't very Hamiltonian all through his career. So I think they want us to be driven towards the centralized, consolidated, Caesarian type of approach as Alexander Hamilton. And if we're using the Federalists, we're going to have a much more likely chance of sticking to his views. Well, if the Federalist is the way to describe the Constitution, then we can actually understand what Hamilton or people who followed his approach, John Marshall, Joseph Story, said in the decades to follow. So I think it's very important to understand the big picture. You can't even read the Federalists many times without actually reading many of the Anti-Federalist papers from Brutus, for example, because they're responding to complaints from or warnings by Anti-Federalists. So you can't actually have a full grasp of this without reading both sides. If you don't, again, this must be the message of this episode. If you don't hear both sides, you aren't actually a free people. So we have to understand all of it. Devin Fuller says, Michael always provides solid content, doing my best. Really appreciate that. Erwin Havernick says, good reading list for the weekend. Thanks. Yes, I would actually just read through it. I mean, some of it isn't super easy reading, but I also linked to that episode. And I think the blog post from Jason Mandrish and Tara Ross could lead you down a little bit of a rabbit hole like I go to. They write really, really well because it's just short stuff and they add some highlights. And I try to go back and forth with that as well. Taking a look a little further in the chat. We're trying to be less problematic. Hamilton, Devin Fuller, Hamilton, America's first swindler. I think he was really the consummate modern politician, incredibly talented, telling people what they wanted to hear on the New York ratifying convention, and then changing his tune years later when he wanted a central bank. Anyways, I'll look a little bit further in the chat later on today, a little bit tomorrow. I get great ideas for future episodes. I try to reply to some questions when I'm able to. You can also email me, team@10thamendmentcenter.com. I read all of them. I'm very, very slow to reply to a select few when I can, but I do appreciate all the feedback. Again, don't forget the membership program, smashing the like button, the reviews on podcasts, and don't forget to have a really good day today. I really appreciate you being here, and I'll see you next time on the path to liberty.